Okay, welcome to the Plexus podcast. Today I'm joined by Peter Connor, a long-term friend of mine and Plexus's, who's a former general counsel for a number of the world's top technology companies and now is a leader of KPMG's new law business, working with general counsels around the world on helping them frame out their strategy and execute to create a better legal function. How are you, Peter?
Great, thanks, Andrew. It's terrific to be with you. Very exciting times, a lot going on, and we're really excited to be working together with you at Plexus and the team, and really helping in-house counsel deal with, let's face it, there's a lot of challenges they're facing over and above the day jobs that they have to do.
Yeah, certainly that's what the data will share with you today, is that the job of the general counsel has never been tougher. So what we're going to do today is we're going to share our latest insights from our general counsel thought leaders research. The interesting thing is the backstory here is we started this program back in 2012 with 4 or 5 general counsels around a lunch table. Really, they asked us to bring them together because they felt that we had a better insight into what's happening in leading legal functions than them, by virtue of the amount of clients that we work with. That's expanded out over the last 6-7 years now to this year 250 general counsels from across most of the leading legal functions in Australia joined our general counsel, thought leaders of the future meetings, which were co-presented obviously with Peter here. So let me start by perhaps taking a step back. So Peter, what we've seen in the data here, and this is partly some third-party data from General Counsel Roundtable, was that quite simply we're operating in a new paradigm, and the seeds of the challenges that general counsels confront now have perhaps laid very early on in the sort of the foundation of legal function. So I think back in the 90s when perhaps you started working with legal functions, and perhaps what year did you go in-house?
It was actually the 80s. I hate to admit it, but there you go.
You're looking good, Peter. You're looking good. So ultimately, when legal functions first got set up, they were largely the company lawyer, predominantly just sort of managing external spend, providing some sort of strategic advice to the board and the CEO. As these functions started to form, businesses recognized 2 quite simple things. One was that simply in-house lawyers were more cost-effective than external lawyers. The second is that they had a comparative advantage, which was their proximity to the business gave them a deeper understanding of risk tolerances, ability to sort of navigate and help the business execute. And so, as you can see here, we saw an expansion of legal budgets over that time. As organizations like GE really popularized the legal function, and legal functional budgets as a percentage of revenue grew substantially in the 90s. The tech wreck happened in the year 2000, and ultimately legal resources as a percentage of budget started a relatively precipitous decline. Yet the expectations of legal functions grew during that period. But really, the big step change happened in the downturn of 2008, where cost consciousness meant businesses really wanted to think differently about how to reduce external legal spend, so they insourced a lot of work. But the bigger issue was that organizations became more complex, regulatory frameworks became both fragmented and global, and so were more difficult to navigate. You saw the rise of litigation, particularly class actions, etc. And so there was a huge acceleration in the demands on legal functions. Yet again, legal resources as a percentage of revenue were largely static over that period as cost control came in. We have seen some increase in legal resources over the last sort of 5 years, but they ultimately haven't been able to keep pace with those demands in the business. And so this research from Gartner's General Counsel Roundtable suggests that 85% of legal tasks within a business go unsupported. So you've got an interesting insight here, given you've kind of been across that entire journey and now working with legal functions around the world. What have you seen change?
Yeah, so you're right. It has evolved quite a lot. So when I first went in-house, you're right, it was generally speaking, it was lawyers coming from law firms, as I did, from a large law firm, and sort of literally going in-house and trying to sort of practice law as if it was a mini law office. And that made sense for a while. But then what happened, as you said, is that the work kept piling up, and lawyers, in-house lawyers, in a way, have created a problem for themselves, in the sense that we tried to please everybody and do everything. And that was okay for a while when we were able to keep staffing up and resourcing. But as you say, what's happened, that certainly the resources haven't kept pace with the amount of work that's coming, the traditional work that's coming in. And that's as a result of regulatory, growth and change in regulatory regulations, but also just the growth in companies and the fact that companies are now, trying to go through digital transformations and all sorts of things like that. So it's a lot more pressures and strains on legal teams. So now, ironically, when I was in-house too, what we tried to do as general counsel was actually to bring as much work in-house as we could and to minimize the amount of work that was being done by others. Ironically, what's happening now is progressive GCs are actually trying to look for what's the sweet spot, what are the things that it makes sense for a legal team to do, and then with the other stuff, find other ways to get that work done, whether that's outsourcing, managed services, working with alternative legal service providers, traditional law firms, using tech to automate these things. So that's the big changes. I think that it's not just, there's the saying, doing more with less. Well, I don't think that's quite right. In fact, it's really not about doing more of the same. In fact, it's doing less of the same.
Yeah.
And it's trying to find what are the things that you should be doing more of, and then finding ways to get out of the things that you don't want to be doing, and focusing on the things that really matter.
Yeah. It's a classic example of kind of what got you here won't get you there.
So true.
What's the sense when you're out there speaking to general counsels? They've seen this as an opportunity, a threat. Are they confused? What's the?
Obviously, there's a lot of variation, and different legal teams. There's no one typical legal team. Legal teams range from one general counsel to, I've done work for Pfizer and HSBC and these kind of companies, which have almost 1,000 lawyers.
Yeah.
And they're all doing different things in different countries. Some are at the beginning of their journey. Others are just starting out. And so I think, the challenges they're facing are on top of the day jobs, by the way, trying to do the day jobs and keep the lights on, all that sort of stuff. It's trying to figure out kind of, okay, what is it that we're trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And what are we, and developing a sort of a plan. Yes, tech's a part of that, a very important part of that, but you need to have this more comprehensive,
holistic.
And kind of go back to thinking about, well, what's your role?
Yeah.
What are you trying to achieve, and what are you trying to, and those sorts of things. So the challenge, I think, is really to kind of, deal with all those day-to-day pressures, whilst at the same time reimagining kind of what the role that the lawyers can play. Because, by the way, they can add value in far more ways than just giving legal advice.
Yeah.
And so it's figuring that out, and how do you do that, and what is that, and how do you achieve that? So the challenge is, in a sense, dealing with that stuff and figuring out how to add more value. That's the number one priority. The challenge might be dealing with all the work and coping with that. But the priority is, how can a legal team add more value?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that gets to the heart of the issue here, which is how do you, what is the value the legal function should provide? How is it currently going in that quest to create value? And what are the implications of the gap of where you want to be versus where you are now? And the interesting thing is, when we looked into that, what we found was that gap, that 85% of legal tasks go unsupported, that could be okay. It could have negligible implications. You can't do everything in a business, obviously. Actually, what we found was the opposite. Interestingly, as a headline metric here, is that 65% of general counsels have turned over in the ASX 100 in the top 3 years, and that's similarly in when we looked at the FTSE 100 and also in the US. So dramatically increase in turnover, and the reason behind that is, yes, 3 out of 5 people in the business say they're not getting the support they need to do their job from the legal function. Yet only 3% of general counsels forecast they'll increase headcount by more than 5% a year for the next 3 years. Now, the implications of that is that the legal function is now seen as equally greatest blocker of strategic execution within the business. So it's tied with IT, with 38% of respondents of a survey of 1,400 and clients of business services saying that legal is the biggest blocker. And so, not surprisingly, 75% of end clients suggest they're not getting the value based on time and money they're spending with the legal function. Now, when we showed this to general counsels, they naturally said, yes, the data on the left-hand side of the page here, I agree with that. We're not able to get to everything. We're not getting budget increase. But on the right-hand side of this, they typically say, hey, look, we're really valued by the business, and I would hate to think that we're a strategic blocker. The interesting thing is, when you look at the data here, what it tells you quite simply is that businesses are voting with their dollars, right? So if they value the legal function more and felt the legal function was a great enabler of strategic execution, no doubt they'd find more budget dollars, as they are for IT, as they are for sales, as they are for marketing. But as you can see here, on the whole, legal functions aren't getting more budgets. So I suppose the interesting thing here is that, Peter, is that there's not more money to throw at the problem. You can't just keep throwing more lawyers at this problem. You know, GCs need to think differently.
They do. And I think just going back to your point there about being a blocker, a perceived blocker, and those sorts of things, and legal tasks, a couple of comments. One is actually when I went in-house, I was European General Counsel for Citrix, the software company, and I was asked to come into that role because there were some issues with the legal team at the time. And what I found was, to my surprise, was that, and this was obviously an extreme situation, but pretty much everything had to go through legal.
Yeah.
And it kind of dawned on me then that, crikey, this is really not what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's really about, but like I said, figuring out what are the things that really add value.
Yeah.
And frankly, getting out of the way.
Yeah.
And finding tools like the business self-help tools and some of the things Gateway can do, for example, to actually enable the business to help themselves.
Yeah.
And then, then you sort of minimize this blocking role.
Yeah.
And you figure out that, frankly, a lot of the stuff that you're doing, it might have been done by legal, but it's not necessarily something you need a law degree for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's not really a legal task. So
yeah.
when you think about it in that way, I think that helps to kind of free up things and opens up new opportunities.
Yeah, it's a new paradigm of thinking. And I think it's interesting that you see this quote here from Bain that that almost 40% of GCs give their team top marks for contributing commercial value to the company, yet only 14% of CEOs do, and that's a survey of a few hundred organizations across the United States. The interesting thing when we looked at the data was actually not the 14%, only 14% of CEOs are tough scorers, was that only 40% of general counsels currently give themselves top marks. And so, obviously the nature of the conversations we're both having with general counsels is one around transformation, which interestingly is like a relatively new term for general counsels to wrap their head around. Yet for most other functions, certainly for finance functions, for example, they've been focused on finance transformation since the 90s. And so what our research showed was that there was actually 4 key challenges that the general counsels seem to be trying to address with their transformation efforts. One is quite simple, more for less. And that's been a game that's been going on probably the entire time you've been an in-house lawyer, Peter. Secondly, as part of that initiative was like reducing time spent on those activities which are higher volume but lower risk and generally don't generate a competitive advantage for a business. Third is around scaling value, and we see that across 2 paradigms. So certainly, how do you scale value across the enterprise? Second was across the life cycle of a legal task, knowing that 90-something% of legal functional resources are dedicated prior to the date of execution or whatever the key event for the legal task is, yet all the risk and value for that task accrues beyond that point. So how do you help the business manage legal risk across a timeline? And fourth is like, how do you more dynamically support the varying needs of the business, knowing that the business is going to have highly fluctuating demand for both capacity and capability across the year, and even a Pfizer with 1,000 lawyers on the team just cannot scale up to meet that. And so historically, a lot of that work has been outsourced. Which of these, if there is one, you finding general counsels are most struggling with?
Right. Well, so before I answer, let me just have a quick comment on transformation, because as you know, I run a lot of workshops with, these legal teams all over the world. And this whole question of transformation, often I spend a lot of time at the beginning of the workshop looking at that question, because you can't assume that, like you and I know that that's something legal teams should be doing for all sorts of reasons, but that's not necessarily the case. That the GC might think that, but not everyone on the leadership team or the broader team thinks about that. So you've got to spend time kind of explaining in a way and articulating the reasons for that. This is not about just incremental change anymore, business as usual change, if you like. That it really is necessary to be thinking about how you can reimagine the role of legal. When you think about the power of technology and the fact that it can do a lot of tasks that legal did before, that the rest of the functions are looking at transformation, the whole company, the organization is looking at transformation. and there's all these conversations about the future of work and all that kind of stuff. I mean, really, is it enough for legal just to kind of just be doing things a little bit quicker and doing the same thing? Not really.
Yeah.
And so it's getting into that and teasing that out so that everyone kind of, and I spend a lot of time with clients on this sort of kind of understanding, going through the change management, focusing on the change management aspects of that, both at a collective team level and at an individual lawyer level.
Yeah.
And that needs to happen. So anyway, that's transformation. But to go back to your question, what's the first thing that kind of comes up? Well, actually, the thing that we're actually in KPMG spending a lot of time with our initial engagements with clients here in Australia is really around what I call, the term I've coined is work management. And by that I mean, looking at all of the different things that the legal team does. In minute detail. And it's frankly, hard work. You got to roll the sleeves up, and some legal teams have some data on this. Typically they don't.
Yeah.
So no data on this stuff.
Yeah.
Got a rough idea. Maybe they do a monthly report or something or what have you. And it's a very high level transactional. So the distinction between matter management and work management. Matter management, that'll capture some of the big things, but what you need to do is focus on kind of looking at that work management aspect and then kind of using that as going through and analyzing and applying different lenses to examine, is this something that you should continue doing or not? And if so, what other options are there? Including automation, including outsourcing, including, various options. So that's the one I think that, yes, there's other areas. Tech, of course, is very important, but you've almost got to work through, there's a more logical sequence you have to follow before you get to tech. As you and I know, there's preparatory work you need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the funny things that we see, and it's the same in transformation journeys across any function, is that people jump to the end. It's a journey, not a destination. And the interesting thing is that it doesn't really matter too much what you do as long as you make a start.
Correct.
I think that the central issue here is that if you look at a legal function, typically there's about a 1 to 1,000 ratio of lawyer to business person. Changes a little bit depending on what the business does, but it's somewhere in that range. About a 0.5% of revenue is spent on legal budgets. So it's impossible for a legal function to ever scale its value or deliver on the expectations of that ratio of people using a traditional 1-to-1 ratio. And so the interesting thing about transformation is that that's the core idea, is how do I deliver value in a different and kind way across that scale. Now, GCs seem to know this. So our data suggests that 98% of general counsels rate transformation as critical to their future success, yet 72% aren't doing anything about it. And the reality is that the 27% who are doing it, most of it's largely kind of a piecemeal approach. And the reason behind this is that this is a new skill for most general counsels. They haven't run a transformation project previously. They've largely just focused on, how do I keep my head above water doing legal work and help my team execute on that. And so they're feeling somewhat lost and overwhelmed by this, and in our experience, largely just kind of kicking the can down the road, hoping that something will change in the future to make it easier on them.
Yeah, no, so true, Andrew. And I think, so again, going back to the comment I made earlier about the historical evolution of an in-house lawyer and their role, I mean, when you think about it, when you're in a law firm, the way you interact with clients is one-on-one. And that makes sense because guess what? You want to have lots of interaction. You want those to be long interactions.
And you get paid for every hour.
That's not the case in-house. And so again, the fact that, lawyers typically come from law firms to work in-house and try and operate in the same way, that one-on-one interaction with everything sort of like a unique interaction, the first time you've ever done it, simply doesn't scale. So you're right. That's why you've got to reimagine that and let go and figure out where the sort of the value is and how best to deliver that is really part of it. But I think with transformation, you're right. The other point there I was going to make is that, it's funny, a GC or an in-house lawyer wouldn't think twice about going to an external law firm to get advice on an area of expertise that they don't feel. And yet they are balk at the idea of getting help
Yeah.
on something that they've never done before,
Yeah.
which is this transformation. And
Yeah.
it is fundamentally different.
Yeah.
You can be the world's best GC, a great leader and all the rest of it, but this transformation thing is different.
Yeah.
And there's a whole framework that you should be following, of which tech is
Yeah.
a piece. You need to be thinking about. That's where we believe we can add value.
Yeah, the difficult thing is not one competency; it's multiple competencies. It's
Yes.
change management. It's looking at what competencies of skills you need within the team. It's looking at structuring work. It's like organizational structuring, adoption of technology, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as you said, even a great general counsel is not going to have all those competencies in house. I think that's interesting when you benchmark them against their peers. Like the CFO will typically have someone on their team as a head of finance transformation, as a full-time role, and they will engage McKinsey or Accenture or KPMG to help them on that journey.
Exactly, and I think that's right. And I think that'll come with time, and I think in a way, it's incumbent on people like you and me, Plexus and KPMG and others, to sort of sell the value in that and why that's so necessary. But I think really this whole transformation thing is something that's new. It's something that, I've written the article called The T-Shaped In-House Lawyer, which is really about trying to tease out what are those new skills that lawyers need.
Yeah.
And they're not going to get those instantly, but I think if over time people can build up those capabilities, that's how I learned those things, just through trial and error over a long time.
Yeah.
Long before people were talking about innovation and transformation. It was just, frankly, a question of survival.
Yeah.
And frankly, of challenging the status quo and doing things differently, which is fun.
Yeah.
It's actually, there is a role for an in-house lawyer that's frankly way more fun than just reading NDAs and, kind of doing all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the most progressive general counsels I work with all say, like their fundamental role is evolving the value that the function delivers. Whereas, the laggards, they see their role as doing legal work. Interesting when we asked as part of our research, our clients, what is the one thing that you focus on, or the top thing on your agenda item? There was no consistency. You'd typically expect that there'd be a consistent, this is our number one priority, whereas as you can see from the data, literally across the board, the field is split. And there's only when we really thought about this that actually general counsels can be grouped into three key buckets. And it fits kind of like with our view of transformation. So on one stage, it's the legal managers. So it's really, how do I allocate and manage work and demonstrate value? There's the risk, what we call the risk managers. So how do I scale risk management? How do I manage the life cycle of legal tasks? And then what we call the transformers. So, the transformers are around how do I increase the productivity of my lawyers? How do I reduce the time spent on churn work? And really try and reposition our most talented lawyers into what we're calling kind of pathfinders, helping the business kind of execute on strategy. And when we look at how that's being implemented, in a large part, general counsel is just saying, look, we're just going to do this through behavioural change. We're just going to say we're going to do more of this and less of that. And largely, it doesn't work out. I kind of remember one of our long-term clients who's on the board of their company. OH&S is a big deal there, and him explained to me, in OH&S we talk about behavioural controls and physical controls. So behavioural controls is like training, physical controls is like putting a barrier on the machine so you can't put your hand in the machine. And they said, look, ultimately putting the barrier in the machine more consistently works than trying to train someone, because training's got a short half-life. And this is what we're seeing with the most progressive functions we're working with, is they're saying, look, in order to drive this, we've got to look at a different mode of organizational design. And the reason we know this works is not only does it works with legal functions, it's the same playbook that's worked well with finance, HR, IT, etc. And really, it's like this, that basically the large majority of work currently is in what we call business facilitation, contract review, approval, negotiation, etc. There's some legal work that is like very technical in nature, particularly high risk. So it might be like tax, litigation, IP, etc. And then there's the part that the business values the most, which is around decision support. So we're executing our strategy. We're going into Asia. What are the things we've got to worry about? How can we navigate those to ultimately generate a competitive advantage? So the transformation playbook at its heart is very, very simple. How do we take capacity out of that business facilitation, high volume, largely lower value legal task, and redirect it into decision support? Now, as I said, the smartest legal functions are actually doing that from an organizational design. So as opposed to organizing their legal function around geographical or business unit alignment or perhaps functional alignment, what they're saying is actually we're going to have a central pool of resources. Some of them are calling it a legal operations center of excellence or something like that. That's just really going to focus on process optimizing those kind of more routine legal tasks with a focus on how do we compress time, cost, and standardize and automate as much as possible. And then we're going to reallocate that capacity towards those sort of pathfinding roles, which are going to be out there in the business, helping navigate and execute on strategy, knowing that in the center there, unfortunately, we're always going to have litigation, we're always going to have tax, etc. And a lot of that's largely going to be outsourced to people who have particular domain expertise in that. Now, interesting from your standpoint, Peter, like you advise a lot of the largest functions in the world on this sort of challenge. To what extent are you seeing people running that playbook effectively? What are the limitations you're seeing?
So, yeah, good question. So, look, honestly, most of the companies I work with, and even the more progressive ones, they're focusing on the, as you said earlier, each company has their own kind of particularly unique challenge. It might be, for example, legal spend, not so much in Australia, but typically over the States and overseas, big outside counsel budgets, and getting that under control is their priority. Whereas, it could be more about engaging with the business. It could be more about, getting out of this low value work. Different priorities. And the trap, and there are many traps in transformation, is one of them is to sort of just focus on that issue.
Yeah.
Whereas I think very few legal teams, have looked at this holistically and are thinking about it in a structured way. Like I said, looking at objectives, looking at your purpose and all these different things, and following. There is a structure that we follow.
Yeah,
when we
playbook.
work with clients. A framework for people to follow, and that gives you your best chance of success of achieving your objectives once you define those very clearly, rather than just putting out the fire and focusing on that fire. So very few legal teams are really doing that in a very comprehensive, holistic way. But that's where we can help by helping to provide that framework and that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think the interesting thing is when we show this model to people, they naturally gravitate to it. But one of the things we hear is like, we're only a small legal function, this doesn't work for us. Whereas actually the most progressive functions we work with are 3-4 person legal functions. And they are still able to segment out this business facilitation, decision support, etc. And because they're small, they're more nimble, and they're able to roll out technology and automation more rapidly to buy that capacity. The interesting thing is that the organizations that we see run this playbook most effectively, they actually increase their headcount year on year. And our hypothesis behind that is largely because they're able to demonstrate to the business that they're adding more value than previously.
Right.
So the overarching idea behind this model is one that's very simple, is that historically legal functions are focused on how do I deliver more value through increasing our capacity to support more decisions. So each year is predominantly a game of war for how do I get more headcount. That hasn't worked. And so what we're seeing is that we've got the functions of the future, but actually the most progressive functions of today are focusing on building the organization's capacity to make better decisions and manage legal risk at scale. So when we look at that in context, like historically, as we said at the beginning, we started out with this idea of the company lawyer, and it was all about technical expertise and law firm management, etc. In the previous period, we went to this era of risk management, and we were focused on competency around commerciality, solutions orientation, compliance with new regulations. They started to form up a little bit of legal department management. But ultimately, they're relatively simplistic functions. Work came in, and everyone worked like hell to try and get that work done without a lot of real thought around where to next. Whereas what we see today is we're definitely in this era of scalable legal services. So obviously, how do we scale legal service delivery through client self-service? How do we demonstrate value through performance measurement? How do we sense and respond to emerging regulations and be that kind of pathfinder? And there's a totally different sort of mindset and skill set and methodology to these functions. Yet, as you said at the outset there, it's startling how few functions are really moving aggressively to this playbook. A lot of functions we speak to are really largely playing lip service because they're just buried in the weeds, trying to manage day-to-day work.
Yeah, and I get the problem too without having this sort of comprehensive, holistic approach is you end up with making changes, but what's the impact of those changes? You know, a lot of change for change's sake, which is not what you want.
Yeah.
You've got to have, you want, because let's face it, change is hard. Any change, whether it's like, you know, behavioral change, whether it's implementing a new tech solution, whatever. It's hard work.
Yeah.
It's really, you put a lot of time and effort into it. And of course, in the in-house context, every time you change something on the legal side, the legal team side, that has a corresponding impact on the business side.
Yeah.
So ultimately, it's all about change management. But, you know, kind of making sure that if you're going to be investing in a change, that it is one that you're going to get terrific impact out of.
Yeah.
And it's going to move you forward in the direction that you want to be going.
Yeah.
And so that's why all these things need to be aligned. And I see unfortunately, a lot of kind of change for change sake.
Yeah, it's almost like buzzword bingo out there. Sometimes you say to general counsels, "What's your strategy?" And they say, "We're setting up legal operations, or we're investing in AI or blockchain, or we're focused on agile." And really, they're jumping to something they've read online without having a consistent understanding of like what are the problems and what's the map forward.
Yep. The good thing is, at least, I guess, there is now. When I started doing this, as you know, I had my own company, Alternative Legal, which I set up about 3 or 4 years ago. When I started talking to GCs, it was like, what are you talking about? You want me to do things? It was a hard sell. Now it's not.
Yeah.
Pretty much everyone gets that they do need to change. They might not have a clear idea about how to do it. And it can be overwhelming with all this, particularly in the tech space. Let's face it. And now there's so many different alternative legal service providers, whatever you want to call it, new law, whatever. It is overwhelming, I think. And so kind of knowing who to partner with. And as you've said before, Andrew, in conversations we've had, I think most GCs are looking not just for a vendor. They're looking for someone who's going to be a strategic partner who can actually help them and has the knowledge and the experience and the insights to help them kind of, help them decide where to go and how to go about this. And rather than someone who's just going to sell them a solution and say, good luck.
Yeah.
And that's really important. And I think, clearly Plexus, I think, does that very, very well.
Yeah. It's one of the frustrations we have is when someone contacts us and says, we want a demo of your technology. And we say, we don't do demos. What we do is try and understand your problem because, technology chasing a problem will only cause more issues. Whereas, if you fully understand the problem you're trying to solve, you can then select the partner for you. And when you think about how this plays out is that, we talked about before that somewhere between 50 and 70% of legal capacity is trapped in these higher volume, more routine legal tasks. There's about 20% of the total legal budget that is spent external, and some of that is overspent as a result of the legal function not having the capacity itself to address the needs that really are within its competency. But the biggest issue is actually that the business is crying out for more support and executing strategy. So obviously the game board here is like, how do we take that 50 to 70% and reallocate that to those high risk, high value activities that generate a competitive advantage? And as you look on the right-hand side of the page here, you can see some of the things that we're seeing progressive functions doing. So obviously embracing automated self-service to support on those more routine activities, giving people in the business and the lawyers productivity tools which are fit for purpose to help people get legal tasks done. Wherever possible on things which you need to outsource is looking at alternate resourcing strategies, whether that's through bringing insourcing through secondments, looking at managed legal services, obviously new law solutions, etc. And then on the top right-hand quartile there, these are largely heterogeneous activities, which really where the legal function should be spending its time. But you need some sort of system of record to better manage that and demonstrate the value you're creating on that. So the overarching idea is that working harder. Lawyers have always been some of the hardest working people in every business. Working hard has largely failed. It's time to work smarter, and the only way that's really going to work is through changing how legal risk gets managed within organizations. So when we talked about this from a kind of like an enterprise lens, like what are the challenges that businesses happen as a result of the historic model of legal functions, we then dived down and we talked about some of the functional challenges of trying to do more with less, etc. But the heart of the issue actually is often right down into how the task is done. And, we were doing some research, Peter, about 4 or 5 years ago, doing process reengineering of legal tasks. And what we found was that there was a really simple pattern that happens on almost every legal task, which is someone in the business has a problem. A lawyer needs to collect the facts of that problem, triage those facts to the right lawyer on the team to begin work, need to apply some sort of risk management framework, whether it is the law or obviously internal governance. Typically, there's drafting or some sort of creation of advice. There's collaboration and negotiation, so internal and external there. There's an approval and an execution. There's storing and reporting, ideally on that, not on the end artifact, being the contract or whatever it is, but actually what's happened up until that point. And then, of course, you want to be able to find that information easily. You want to be able to analyze that to gain insights from it. But somewhere between 25 and 40% of a lawyer's time is spent on sifting through this giant ball of admin. So you think about across that, I'm a person in a business. I want an NDA. I know, Peter, you're the general counsel, so I'll ping you an email and say, Peter, I need an NDA. You're obviously not the NDA guy. Hopefully there's no one on the team who's an NDA a person. Then you got to collect the facts. That's typically back and forward over email because the client doesn't know what the right facts are. The facts change or they're inaccurate facts, etc. And creating a lot of rework for the lawyer. There's that triage mechanism that's still manual and that requires a lot of tracking. And when we look at applying risk management, on one end of the spectrum, it might be that you've got a lawyer who's risk averse. The other end of the spectrum, you got someone in the business who manages this themselves and kind of goes bush lawyer on you, unnecessarily exposing the business to risk. When you think about drafting, you got lawyers drafting the same clause over and over again, or spending a hell of a lot of time just kind of formatting a document. When you look at that collaboration and negotiation, there's huge amounts of version control issues. And there's some poor lawyers sitting at 10 o'clock at night trying to bring 4 different versions of the same document together. And there's obviously no tracking of all those different versions. So later on, it's very difficult for you to piece together what actually happened. Interestingly, most organizations that approval or execution of a contract is still manual. In some cases, we've got clients who are literally printing out printing out the contract and some sort of contract signature sheet, walking around the office trying to find the right person to sign it. And then the end of this process here is like, okay, you got the NDA signed, and then what happened to it? Is it in someone's desk drawer? Do you have a copy of it at all? There's obviously no analytics across that. And so what's the point of the whole process if you don't have the contract? So, Peter, you've obviously been an in-house lawyer for a long time. Across that, what are the deeper frustrations that you see?
Yeah, well, firstly, I think that's a great slide. I've said it to you before. I love that slide. It corresponds with my own personal experience when I was GC, but also we've done a bit of research ourselves here at KPMG to kind of look at what are the top problems. And frankly, that's them. That's the life cycle. And depending on like the department, most departments will have most of those problems. Some of them might have a solution for 1 or 2 of those, but typically they don't. And so that's a wonderful way, I think, of looking at it, like you say, at a micro level, breaking it down a little bit and kind of saying, well, these are the things that you need to be focusing on and finding a way to address that. So, yeah, they are absolutely the challenges that, and that scenario you just described is so typical. I think most GCs listening to this podcast will kind of be smiling and going, yep, and looking at that slide going, yep, that's us for the most part.
Yeah,
it rings true.
Absolutely. And so you think about this, you've got incredibly talented folks who can add immense value to the business that really only a couple of slices of this process is really where they should be slotting in. But they often feel they need to kind of project manage this whole thing because otherwise it slips off the rail.
And the problems with that, generally speaking, it's the lack of transparency, which of course is one of the things the business really cry out for. So the lack of transparency, the lack of data, the lack of the ability to collaborate and share and to minimize the administrative work that you're doing. These are some of the problems that come out of those things. And they are real fundamental problems to certainly obstacles to transformation and change, let alone adding value. Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the lead indicators we see of this is that when we speak to general counsel, you say, Alexa, what's your deepest frustration? They often, when it comes down to it, they say email. They get a couple hundred emails a day. And when you look at email, the reason you're getting emails is largely because you're using that as a tool for something it's not designed to do. So if you think about this, a client has a problem, there's at least one email clicked in the fax, there's maybe 4 or 5 emails there, triage into a lawyer, 4 or 5, then there's the client checking in on the process, there's a few emails there, et cetera, all across this. So you probably on one matter got 50 emails. So if you're doing a few hundred matters a year, that's a few thousand emails you got to try and manage through. And so the interesting thing is that there are solutions to these problems. And so, you could have an app that, someone in the business could request legal support. This is probably how you interface with the IT function now, HR function, et cetera. This is already happening in your organization. In fact, one of the things that I find funny is that the receptionist is most organizations are using sort of self-help tools already, yet the lawyers aren't. There's standardized briefing, so you can consistently get the right facts, automated triage. You can then automate advice, automate contract generation, for example. You can have negotiation portals or collaboration tools to collaborate. E-signatures as a technology has been around for 20, 25 years, yet very, very limited adoption. Or at least not enough adoption, I should say. Contract lifecycle management, matter management, analytics, search, reporting, etc. And so you can get these tools in isolation and give your function a 40% productivity boost, or of course you can end-to-end automate legal tasks across that life cycle, leveraging those tools. And the interesting thing is those functions who have adopted that see a 65% increase in productivity.
So, Andrew, as you know, when I did a post on LinkedIn recently about this topic of, in technical terms, it's sort of, the platform versus the point product. So again, this is one of the challenges for GCs and in-house legal teams is there's a temptation. They got this choice between, do I go for the best of breed point product on, let's say, document automation or whatever it might be, or e-signature or something, or do I look at, like you say, at a platform, something like Legal Gateway, something that's designed to be a platform?
Yeah.
And first of all, you've got to understand the difference between those two things. They're fundamentally different. Other functions have, sales has Salesforce, finance has SAP. They are true platforms in the sense that you can go to that platform, you can use that platform, and frankly, you can get most of your work done. You don't have to go to different things. You don't have to worry about integration of these kind of things. So there's so many traps in this technology space, one of which is the temptation to get the best of breed, thing for your particular unique, requirement. But I think, looking at the value of a true platform, and that's something you got to be careful about. There's obviously everyone's marketing themselves as a platform.
Yeah.
But typically, what happens is they start life as a point product, and they're trying to sort of, branch out to do other things, and that's okay. But I think as a buyer of technology, you got to be really looking at that and going, frankly, is that truly, how realistic is it that it's going to do those things? Or is it built with the intention of it being a platform right from the outset? So interesting point, and I think one that, legal teams are going to have to sort of look at and struggle with. And then also thinking about, is it just a platform to help the legal team do the work in the same old way? Or is it a platform to allow you to realize your vision of where you want to get to? And that's the other thing. So I think Gateway, for example, is a very exciting product. And I have to say, a very exciting product that offers a lot.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I think there's so many traps on this technology journey that we see general counsels falling into, but perhaps the biggest is just not having anything. And so if you think about it, every function within an organization has a system of record to manage their core asset. So obviously it's capital for finance, and they've got ERP. Obviously it's customer data for sales, and so they've got CRM, HROS for HR, etc. And the interesting thing is, in a modern enterprise which is founded on IP, it's legal tasks which are the major store of value within that business. Yet currently, there's no sophisticated system of record to help legal functions or people in the business manage that. And that's a huge oversight. And it's a mind-blowing that there's functions out there that are leveraging no functionally specific technology. But as you said, the challenge is not that general counsels don't see that. It's like navigating the maze of how to get this done. So interestingly, in our research, what it clearly showed is that those functions have the greatest transformational maturity, also have the greatest adoption of technology, or the largest percentage of their budget spent on technology. And indeed, total technology spend is going to dramatically increase. So by our research, about 111% increase in technology budgets over the next couple of years, albeit from a very, very low base. The categories that we see have the highest ROI is around providing automated self-service to the business. So it's buying that capacity to then reinvest in more strategic activities, or of course, reinvest in transformation activities. Followed by some things around productivity and tracking of matters. But as you said, the overarchingly issue is that the vendor selection process is not something that the legal functions have done a lot of, and so they're making poor choices. So interestingly, the average customer satisfaction of enterprise technology is about 76%, whereas as you can see from this data, there's on the whole, very low satisfaction from historic purchases of technology. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question first, I think, in fact, I spoke with a vendor once who admitted to me that, actually they could get some sales, they could make the sale of the product, but the adoption of the technology just wasn't happening. And that was largely because, in-house legal teams don't go through the change management aspects of thinking about that. And there's lots to think about there. So it's one thing to get some tech in, but you've got, leaving aside issues of integration with existing business systems and those other sorts of issues, the adoption is the big one. And the problem is, if you don't do that right the first time, and you lose your credibility.
Yeah, scorched earth.
It's pretty hard to come back and recover from that and say, hey, guess what? We've got another thing we want to try. So I think that's the immediate answer to the question. Just more generally, I think, going back to this challenge of, tech and perhaps the relative slowness of adoption of tech, I think, again, legal departments don't have big budgets. So, and they've got budgets for external legal counsel, but typically not for technology, not for transformation, not for consulting and some of these other offerings. So I think one of our challenges is to try and kind of help legal teams create some budget, i.e. by looking at where they are spending that, particularly the external budget, and kind of seeing if you can free up some money there to devote to something that's really going to make a difference. It's going to move the needle, not just keep, on transactions. So that's one thing. A second thought there is that I think where you get most success around this is to think about this. It's not about going to the CFO and saying, hey, I want to have this tech to run the legal department better, but how you can present that to the business in such a way that it's actually for the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you do it that way, then we've had some success with clients who then will be able to get budget from the business, because guess what? It really does help the business.
Yeah.
And that's where I think there's some real opportunity, and we've had some success doing that.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point. I mean, one of the things that GCs say, oh, look, I don't have a technology budget, so I can't buy technology. Whereas if you look at it, if the technology does legal work or helps you get legal work done, why couldn't you access your external spend budget to fund that?
Well, that's what you can, but that requires a little bit of a change in mindset in terms of the way in which you engage. And it's interesting, and I was guilty of it myself when I was in house. You don't think twice about going out and getting a second opinion, or an opinion, from an external law firm, and it kind of you try and manage that, a reasonable cost, but in a sense, there's often not in many cases, not a limit on what you can spend, or if there is, it's a pretty big one. Whereas, and to try and sort of take from that, requires a change in behavior. It requires you looking at that spend and being critical, analyzing and saying, okay, first of all, do I need to go out? And if so, do I need to go out to that provider, to that law firm? And is there a way we can do this in a way where it's, I'm not spending as much? So literally, and I do exercises in the workshops with legal teams to challenge their thinking on how they can create money to then invest, not spend, invest on moving the needle for the team and helping their transformation efforts.
Yeah, super interesting point. I think coming back to the issues around satisfaction, so 70% of all technology spend historically, the 70% of risks in it is, adoption. It's a great point there. Some of the other things we see is, as you said, people go and buying these point solutions, and they end up with like having multiple train stations out across the country without any train tracks leading into them, and wondering why no one, including their own lawyers, are doing this, and because they're so busy, and it ends up being one more thing to do at the end of the day. The other one that's interesting is that a lot of the legal technology was pretty old, and so kind of like, would you buy a Toyota from the 90s now? Probably not, because they haven't, it wouldn't be as good as a modern car. Same thing, people are buying, technology's been around for a long time, feeling it's lower risk, but actually finding that the underlying architecture makes these quite clunky. And
or it may be that a lot of the tech started off as for law firms.
Oh, that is a very good point.
And then they're trying to retrofit it to an in-house context, which honestly just doesn't work very well, typically speaking.
Yeah, the lead indicator we see there is if the pricing model is around a seat license, it's probably not going to translate well in-house, even if the underlying technology is good, because you can't give people in the business access to it. What we've set out here is actually the biggest issues we see on what we call the transformation doom loop. Some things to pick out here in particular is what we call the tomorrow fallacy, which is quite simple. Is like, look, if I could just get this litigation, I just get this project off my desk, I can finally get to the transformation. And so the flip on that is the progressive folks, they ring fence 20% of their time day on day to focus on improving the machine and working on the business, not just in the business. That's kind of tied with the kind of urgent over important. There's always a bit of client work that's urgent, and so always kicking the can down the road on functional change. The under resourcing piece is one that we see a lot of. There's two categories in that. One, just not having the budget or resources that are dedicated to it. But the second is actually selecting who works on this. And so they'll typically say, Peter's interested in this space. So Peter, I probably shouldn't use your name, Peter, but Peter or Sarah is interested, so I'll get them to run it, although they've got no experience in this area. They've got no clout to get things done. And ultimately, this is something we see the general counsel is really going to own. You talked a moment ago about the legal center business case. That's the biggest killer on the budget conversation, saying we're too busy. It's a typical conversation. They go to the CFO and say, we're too busy, we're too overworked, we need some tools. And the CFO is like, hey, I shut down business cases for a job. Yeah. You got to be better than that to get some resources. One of the interesting ones there, number 6 here, is over-reliance on traditional vendors. I can't tell you how often I speak to general counsels and they say, well, we should go to our panel firms and ask them for advice or what they should be doing. And we kind of go, well, you don't go to your dentist to fix your car. So probably going to someone who's got some expertise, because I can tell you the traditional law firms are probably less efficient than you guys are, because their incentive schemes are wired a different way. And the last one, which again you've done a good job of hitting on, is under focus on adoption. So when all that is said and done, they get a solution in there, and they don't focus on how to ensure or mandate not only my team but people in the business utilize this. So Peter, from your perspective, what maybe on that map there, maybe not, are the biggest stumbling blocks you see?
Yeah. So just to pick up on a couple of points. So as I said earlier, I think number one, in fact, I'm doing a talk in Malaysia actually on transformation traps in a couple of weeks. So I've been preparing the speech for that a little bit and thinking about that. And I think one of them, there's so many traps, but probably one of the fundamental ones is this, as I said earlier, this diving into one thing rather than stepping back a little bit, take a few steps back. Yeah, exactly. Figure out what you want to do and have a plan. Have a plan. It's got to be a plan, of which technology is a part. So there's a technology component to that, but there's also all these other things. And having a plan, very few in-house legal teams have a strategic plan, and not a business as usual strategic plan, but a transformation strategic plan, and kind of understanding how all that fits in with your mission, your vision, your goals, your values, that sort of stuff. So that's one thing. And then I think, and having a framework, and then following the framework and having a clear direction. I think just picking up on some of the other things you mentioned there. The law firm thing's interesting because I do some work with a lot of very big financial institutions, global financial institutions, and they have big external spend, and so they have this thing which I think it's called sort of that value-added, things that the law firms throw in. Basically it's a percentage of the spend, which they'll say, look, we'll give you free. And I said to these clients, well, look, you know, what you're getting may not necessarily be what you need.
Yeah.
It might be free.
You get what you pay for sometimes.
Yeah. And with all due respect, most law firms, there are a couple of exceptions, but most law firms, you know, aren't necessarily the, you know, shining examples of what you want to be doing. And secondly, don't understand the in-house context. It's so different. And in fact, it's getting more different.
Yeah.
When you think about this evolution of the role of the in-house lawyer, it's getting further and further away
from the private practice
black letter. Private practice lawyer does.
Yeah.
And so, you know, honestly, even in people who work in law firms who have a little bit of time in-house, they just don't fundamentally understand.
Yeah.
And by the way, they have a different interest.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those things make a huge difference. You know,
how can I build dependence on my law firm, not free dependence? Yeah.
I mean, there's an inherent conflict there by a large part. But look, and that's the other thing. And I think then, other traps. I mean, I think in the technology space, we touched on some of those. As you said, there's under-resourcing and having it. It's one thing to have a plan. It's then saying, okay, we're going to dedicate some resource, not just someone who's happened to have an interest in it, but someone who really is committed to it, does have the ability to influence things, does have the drive. It's essentially driving, you know, change, having the plan and just being sort of, you know, efficient at driving through and delivering on those things. And we'll hold people accountable. Yeah. Because if you don't do that, the best of plans will just fall by the wayside. Yeah. And you'll end up reverting back to the way you've always done things. That's just the way it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, look, what the data clearly shows is that there's issues across the whole journey here. Certainly securing budget and resources is you know, rated as one of the biggest challenges here. And it's something that we see, you know, general counsels just aren't equipped to do. They're good at walking into the CFO's office and say, hey, we've just got a massive litigation. I need budget for that. And that gives them a kind of a false sense of security or confidence that they'll get budget for other resources. Yet, interestingly, they're not willing to look at, you know, how they can, you know, use some of their existing budget to fund improvement initiatives. So, you know, one of the philosophies we say to our clients is like, you got to give to get. You know, CFOs are very skeptical of general counsels when they come in and just ask for a new budget. Whereas if you go in and say, hey, I'm going to partly fund this, but given the business benefit is X, I want some help from you or from other parts of the business in funding that. We talked a bit about, you know, about what Gateway is able to do with this kind of modular approach of providing self-service and automation, you know, productivity tools to help the business get things done. And then, of course, what we call the operating system. I think what's interesting about this is that everyone recognizes they should have contract management, matter management, analytics, reporting, etc. The problem is most systems are set up that the lawyers have to enter in all the data. That's hugely problematic because it's kind of one more thing to do at the end of the day, and so no one uses it. You can change the game and sugarcoat that creation of that operating system or the system of record there by giving people in the business and of course your lawyers the tools that they need to do the job. Again, looking at the receptionist example there, it's really interesting. Most offices you walk in, you are using a self-help tool, a self-service tool that then publishes to their system of record. When you look at finance, it happens the same. You do your expense claim. Guess what? That gets sucked into the ERP system, IT, HR, etc. Legal's just late to the party of using that model where you have tools that help people get their job done. That then creates the data and the source that you need. But overarchingly, regardless of what you do, as you know, you said earlier, Peter, like the big challenge is just making a start. And so what we see here is that ultimately there's two legal functions that get broken out here. One is what we call the hamster wheel model, where the GC constantly is buried, working nights and weekends, just trying to keep their head above water and never finds the time or never makes the time, as you say, to really invest in continuous improvement and improving the function. Ultimately, they're largely the GCs that are getting replaced now. On the flip side, we have the flywheel. And the flywheel is, you know, just making a start. It could be something very simple to try and buy that capacity. It could be, you know, starting with working with guys like you, Peter, to map out, you know, a multi-year kind of strategy or plan to start executing on. Could be providing some simple self-help, you know, just template automation or something like that for the business. But ultimately trying to buy some capacity and then consistently reinvesting that additional capacity in continuous improvement. The difference between these two functions is startling. So on the left-hand side here, we see very low engagement from lawyers. Only 16% lawyers are engaged by the work they do because they're doing things which aren't particularly interesting. We see businesses that are very frustrated. We see budgets that are static or declining, all the things you don't want to have as a leader of a function. On the right-hand side here, we see a totally different game. We see general counsels getting promoted to having a true seat at the table for the first time. We see lawyers vastly more engaged. Obviously, business stakeholders vastly more satisfied because they're able to get things done more efficiently. And by virtue of that, the lawyers are able to be freed up to actually having, the strategic dialogue that they, are particularly interested in. So Peter, I suppose, to wrap here, you're obviously a world expert in this space. How can folks get a hold of you if they need help, support, or thought partnership on this?
Yeah, so my LinkedIn profile or KPMG, it's pconnor@kpmg.com.au. Contact me there. Yeah, it's fun. It's a great. I'm really enjoying it because for me, it's I'm reimagined my role and my life, and doing this is a lot of fun. I just happen to have had the benefit of some experience at doing it. Probably more so than most actually. I think I've worked with probably 25 big brand name legal teams all over the world in China and the States and Europe and here in Australia, and it's fun to get to know these teams and the challenges they're facing, and to really help them, like you say, become a sort of a strategic thought partner, and to try and help them, give them insights into things that maybe they hadn't thought about. And the more progressive GCs, I had to say, more typically female, are the ones that are open to that. They're open to saying, you know what, maybe I'm not the expert in this, and I am open to trying something a little bit different. It's great to work with those, but I work with a full range of clients, from those that are really into it and those that are frankly quite resistant. It's fun to sort of have them look at that and to develop you want to start small, but you want to think big. That's one of the classic Google sayings of innovation. Think big. You've got to have the vision.
Yeah.
So that's actually where I spend a lot of time, is teasing that out. What is this big picture? What could you be doing if you weren't doing these menial things? And that's frankly where it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I say, to run a marathon, you must first take a step. And I think what's exciting for us is that we've seen this dialogue evolve over a long period. And now is the time that GCs are really acting on this seriously. And the exciting thing is they've got a whole new toolkit. Once upon a time, it was, outsource or insource. That were the two options. Now there's a plethora of exciting things you can be doing to improve your function. So thank you for listening to the Plexus podcast. I'm Andrew Mellett. You can reach me on Mellett, it's AMELLETT, at plxs.com.au. Thank you very much.